extractive material under the ground to extract. So then what? And finally, as the world has embraced digital technology, design has not been left far behind. In fact, it's one of the avant-garde sectors in which technology is being embraced. And in many ways, that's the third and most ultimate estrangement between design and material. It's the dematerialization of design in a virtual context. So we hope to cover a lot of ground. And I see my fourth panelist, Avinash, has also joined us. Welcome, Avi. Good to have you from Goa. We are able to do this thanks to AFD. And what I would like to do to begin things is perhaps here in the physical realm, we can start first with Ashay. Tell us a little bit about the work you do, about Theli, and tell us what your opinion on how design and material meet or divide are.
Hi, I'm Ashay. I'm the CEO of Theli. So Theli is the Hindi word for plastic bags. And as the name suggests, we make shoes out of plastic bags. I invented this leather replacement that's called Thelitex. It's made entirely out of waste plastic bags. The production process doesn't use any chemicals or doesn't release any toxic byproducts, but it looks and feels exactly like leather. And we make shoes out of them. I'm wearing them. Also, I wear them every day. Yeah, and so we started 2 years ago. We launched in July of 2021, so it's been pretty much exactly 2 years now. Yeah, and we're selling on our website. We're available globally. We're in a bunch of stores. The shoes on an average are made from 10 plastic bags and 12 plastic bottles. All the fabrics that we use are 100% recycled, so there's absolutely no virgin material used. Apart from this, there's all the other materials are biodegradable. So, for example, the foam that we use is made from algae, and so it's sustainably produced. It can degrade. Even the packaging is made from recycled paper. It's got basil seeds embedded in it, so you can actually plant the box. And it's also dyed with waste coffee grounds, so it's brown. That's how. Yeah, and yeah, that's that's about it for the brand. I mean, the fabric that I've made, it's not only limited to shoes. Very soon, it'll be available for people to purchase. We're trying it out for a very wide array of things, furniture, cars, etc. Sorry, what was the second part of it?
No, it was to do with what you think about material, but I think your answer kind of reveals a lot about the effort you put in into trying to rethink
Right. Yeah.
what all you can rely on new materials, right?
Yeah.
So what causes that? Why don't you share very briefly what made you think of this and what motivates you?
I mean, firstly, when I studied accessory design in FIT, and fabric was just very expensive, especially leather. Leather available in like the leather district in New York is quite good, but it's terribly expensive. I've also seen like the leather production, and it's quite horrible to look at. Apart from that, my mom also used to run a waste management plant in Bombay. So I sort of saw the issue of plastic waste firsthand, especially plastic bags. The strange thing is that we use 1 trillion plastic bags every year, but nobody recycles them at all apart from us, really. They don't hold any monetary value, so nobody collects them. They're not segregated. They just end up in landfills and oceans, etc. So yeah, it's quite weird that nobody else did this before us. There's been a few companies that have done it on a smaller sort of scale, where they're weaving the plastic bags into fabric, but it's a very long, tedious process. It's very handmade and slow, but you know, we got machines that, you know, you just dump the plastic bags in and then it extrudes out as fabric.
Good. Sometimes simplicity is the key, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to you because I'm interested in understanding the challenges in having set up this production line that relies completely on uh, legacy materials. Bharti, over to you. Tell us all about Chintan and what you think about design and material.
So thanks, Madhav. But I'm very excited about your work this evening because I am going to talk to you later. I work with a lot of waste picker women, and we'll see if we can actually create a trade channel with you. And that would be just wonderful. But we'll talk about that later. I love your shoes as well. Um, Essentially, Chintan looks at solutions to the big environmental problems that we are the most interested in. And what are we most interested in? We began with, well, when we began with everything, biodiversity, this and that, but obviously it had to be chopped down. So we began working on waste. Then we began working on air pollution, and now for the last some years also climate change. And if you look at all of these, there's a particular thing that happens, which is that firstly, nobody really has much data. Secondly, when they have data, that data is very skewed because it doesn't really represent how the poor, which is about 30% of those in cities, for example, because they live in slums. Obviously, there are other forms of marginal populations, there are other forms of being vulnerable, but they're not included in solutions. So when we began our work with waste, for example, we were looking at what solutions would work for the city, but how do waste pickers earn, and waste pickers are the bottom of the recycling chain, but they're also foundational to recycling. So all these laws like the extended producer responsibility would just, as it is, they're falling flat on their face, but they would completely have been buried in the ground if you didn't have the informal sector. And we like to call it unorganized, which is quite patronizing because it's actually extraordinarily well organized. And you have about 15 lakh waste pickers alone who pick up almost everything that's recycled, almost everything, not everything, goes through the informal chain. And what's really interesting is how this chain is run by waste pickers. They're very marginal people. Some are women, many are not. And they can segregate a piece of plastic into something like 52 different categories, depending on who's going to buy it, and so on and so forth. So if it wasn't for them, our cities would be truly, truly filthy. There's quite a lot of global work on Indian cities as well as global cities. India, of course, is home to 10% of all the world's waste pickers. So we tried to look at solutions that would help waste pickers. And we organized them so that we could understand what they saw was a solution for themselves, because obviously a middle class approach to a solution is a kind of a very strange approach to a solution. And they said, oh, the police really beats us. And none of them really talked of income. Just fascinating, right? And then they said, oh, kids don't, our kids are always picking trash. Just fascinating. And you'd say, what about money? What about money? Don't you want to earn more money? And they'd say, no, but first we don't want to be beaten by police. Then we don't want to be insulted. And above all, number one, let the kids somehow be sent to school. Over time, obviously, much of that has happened. 10,000 kids from landfills and others through our No Child in Trash have gone to school and graduated, and some are graduating. Some get married the day they turn 21, 18, all that. But the solutions have really been about solid waste. So for example, there's a brand called Magic Mitti, which is all about composting. And why that's really great is because landfills, all the wet waste, which is almost 50% of the waste of this country, results in methane. And now in the last year, all the new science is telling us that we shouldn't underestimate the role of methane in climate change. And it's much more lethal than we ever imagined. And if you were to look at cities, waste and dumping of waste in landfills is a great cause of methane because all the wet waste rots and gives out methane. And So instead, if you're moving to composting and women can actually get money out of it with very flexible hours, that's great. So we've been doing all kinds of zero waste solutions. We'll pick up your e-waste, which we do for a lot of people. And there are lots and lots of waste pickers in North India who we worked with, and so on. Now move out, and there's all these other issues. For example, I'll just briefly mention climate change, white roofs. Now everyone in the design world will tell us, and we also, is just paint these roofs white. I mean, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation is doing that, so a lot. But what we're finding is, firstly, if you use tuna or distemper or whatever, because that's the cheapest, anytime there's Andhi, and we have a lot of it, you just have a lot of air pollution and everybody's sneezing. The second thing is, a lot of urban poor, actually the homes are so small that they use their tiny little chats and use it as storage. So then the science is annihilated. There, you can't keep that kind of house cool, right? So you have to think of other ways. So that's the kind of work we do in climate change. We set up about 5,000 urban farms with women so that they could eat better, because all the data was showing they didn't eat any vegetables. And as we know, women eat last and least, and so on. So we're also looking at solutions which people can implement, which they like the idea of, which they themselves want to do. Having said all that, we also work on repair, and I find it really disconcerting how when you have mochis, you have people like that. Those are people we do work with, but it's becoming increasingly harder and harder to repair, and that's because products for the longest time in our lives have been designed. I mean, there's planned obsolescence, right? That's why after a few years, your iPhone just becomes very slow. You don't know what to do. And even if you delete everything, it's no use, right? And there's no logic for that. And for example, for those of you who ever step into the kitchen, there's something called a NutriBullet. It's a tiny little blender. You can do anything with it, and it's very convenient. And that thing cannot be repaired, whereas a normal Sumit can be repaired. So I have a 15 or 18-year-old Sumit, and in the last 10 years, I've had to buy 3 NutriBullets, because actually I just blend everything and try to eat it up or drink it up or bake it or something. So, just quick to, give yourself some food. So even my dog likes smoothies. So it's so easy to have a really good, but you cannot repair it. So there's a whole thing. Even if you look at vehicles, a lot of the repair industry tells you that new buses are very hard to repair, and they hate them. They say, "ये क्या कर दिया है टाटा वालों ने, हमारे पेट पे लात मार दी है." Or go anywhere in Western UP, you'll hear this. And there are many other examples. I won't go on, I won't belabor the point. But I think we're getting very new kinds of wastes, which we're throwing away because they were never designed. They were never designed from a planetary perspective. And I think the greatest example of failure really are the floods in places like Himachal, but also places like Delhi. I mean, there are thousands of factors for those, and I don't want to kind of talk about truly bad planning and a complete unscientific way of looking at ecosystems. But what I will say is that Malba played a big role. What is Malba? It's CND waste. And if you think of it, on one hand, there's a huge SOS happening about sand mining, because you're mining all this sand, and most of the built area of India is still not built. It's going to be built in the next 10 years. So where are you going to get all this cement from, right? Or the sand? You're trying to mine your sand, your beds. They're more prone to flooding. You're killing ecosystems. The state of the birds recently has shown us how grasslands are dying, how the biggest threat in Delhi, because we're sitting in Delhi, the biggest threat to birds are floodplain birds. So all these larks and sand larks that you used to see near Wazirabad, you're not seeing them for the last few years because you've taken away the sand. Like, where are these larks going to come and sit? So I'll end this by saying that a lot of that Malwa could have been used if we had designed our construction and designed our systems. it would have really helped and it wouldn't have come in the way. And we might still have had floods, but maybe different intensity. But even for Delhi, all our floodplains are full of these hillocks. On the other hand, we're mining. Just go any day and look at Noida. So, so we are actually in a really strange position. We don't think big picture.
So thank you for that, because I think, Bharti, I think it took that sort of a long discussion to bring into focus how these things are not simple, straightforward solutionering. There are these sort of vicious, I won't even say cycle, but vicious eddies, which kind of circle on themselves, which create a lot of hurdles for even us as designers or as design thinkers to bring in. Now, for a perspective from the other part of the world, but a situation that's not very different from India. I see Pedro is here, but Natalia hasn't joined us. He had apologized for her absence. So you bear the weight of two, Pedro, in explaining to us a little bit more about your organization, Archivo Reuso, and what motivated you to start that business.
Hi, so me and Natalia and now Fernanda, so we are 3 partners, and we found Archivo, which is a company which deals with basically the reuse of construction materials. So in a very, if I were to explain it really quick, we basically take either homes that are being demolished for the construction of bigger buildings, or in apartments or office spaces that are going through really radical renovations. And we don't do demolition, we enter just before the demolition. So after the previous inhabitant leaves, but before demolition, we enter and we dismantle carefully all the materials, take them to a storage, put those on the site with a really strict process of measuring and photographing. And then we are both resellers in the sense of a regular store where you can go and buy a door or a window or anything. But also we act as consultants to viabilize the biggest amount of reuse possible. So in a sense, when designers come, and with designers, mostly architects, what we demand for them is a little bit of flexibility, because they come with the design for a house and we look at their house and say, look, if you want this to be the exact same house that you have designed, we won't have the materials, most likely. But if this door can be 20 centimeters larger, and this door can be 20 centimeters longer, then you have those and those and those possibilities. So it's in a sense a process of designing with consideration of actual things that already exist, which is quite different from the prospect of regular architecture, where the process of designing architecture, at least in Brazil, as we are taught in schools, is that we go from abstraction to detailing. So when the project starts, it's just a bunch of lines and there's no material reality to it. And when material comes in, it's on the last part of the process, and a whole bunch of decisions has already been taken that it would be very workful to change the whole design. So it would mean more work for the architect. So reuse, if you design the traditional way, reuse is reworking and lots of work. So we try to convince people that you can design the other way around. Instead of designing from abstraction to detailing, you can start from the detailing, which is, I already have those materials at hand, and then go through a sort of poetics and go through an abstraction that comes from those really actual things. In a sense, it's very different from what both the previous speakers spoke, because it's not recycling, it's reuse. So in a sense, it is the biggest difference is that's the thing about repair is quite true. So the problem we have right now is that mostly of what Archivo dismantles nowadays are buildings that were originally built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. For some reason, that's what obsolescence in Salvador, which is my city, is now taking on. And those buildings were built actually with prime materials, so really strong woods. Brazil has a tradition of noble woods, which are very resistant, and but also other materials such as stones, glass, and this is viable for us nowadays in the sense that we can dismantle and do the whole logistics and still sell those materials at a viable market price. But if we are going to take the dismantling of buildings that are being built now, like on the 2000s or on the 90s, architecture has become so cheap in terms of materials that our enterprise would no longer actually be viable, in the sense that not only materials are cheaper, but also they are being installed in such a way that they cannot be dismantled. So when we dismantle houses from the 40s, we can actually take the ceramic tiles from the floor because they were not put in the floor with cement. But when we are dismantling a house from the 90s, we cannot do this anymore. So tiles, ceramic tiles were reusable and now they are not. So in the sense, it's a really straightforward enterprise, but which deals with lots and lots of complexities. In the sense, this is one of the biggest difference with the recycling industry, in the sense that recycling generally tries to uniformize the material before dealing with it. So you take a lot of plastic bags, but you uniformize it in a sort of new fabric. And then you work with a new fabric in a standard process. And with reuse, it's really hard to do because each material is actually one material. So this is very, the thing you were saying, it's very slow in the sense. So if I have a website for selling t-shirts, I can take one picture of one t-shirt and it's 5,000 units in the website. So our website is basically one picture, one login for each door, which basically exists only one time. So the process of keeping a reuse material store organized is working against entropy like every day. So it's just very local attempts to reducing waste, in the sense that there's not too much transportation. Things are generally moved between dismantling and reuse, I don't know, less than 15 kilometers at most. So it's a very town-based approach to reuse and architecture, in a sense.
Thank you for that, Petru. I think what's becoming apparent is clearly all three speakers have spoken about a certain importance of economic viability, perhaps even in financial restructuring of where one finds value across a very large economic spectrum. And the other thing is, of course, you've now become very familiar as to what the real backbreaking work in trying to imagine design in this new context of pre-existing materials as opposed to new materials is. What Pedro revealed, what Ashay said, and even what Bharti spoke about, tells us the kind of gaps and distances we need to the challenges we need to cross. Lastly, Avinash, who joined a little bit late. Avi, you missed out on your introduction. So I will very quickly ask you to jump in. Avi is not only a game designer with a wonderful game called Antriksh Sanchar. He's also part of a organization called Quicksand that does design research. And he is also a performer. So he's a audio visual music performer. He used to be part of a group called Blot. So Avi, what are your thoughts across the spectrum of the multiple things that you do on the potentials of, say, the dematerialization of design in the virtual world? What are the advantages of that you see? And other stuff like in your work in Quicksand, base of pyramid work, kind of stuff that would overlap with what Bharti spoke about. What is your insight on what are the core issues between, or core distances between design and material?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for having me here. So speaking just a little bit on my own background, I've been running a studio called Quicksand for the last 20 years now. Quicksand is essentially a human-centered design firm, and almost all of our work in the last decade has been in the development sector, where we work across a wide variety of issues. My personal topics of work, for reference, are in the context of public health, mental health. I've done a lot of work in the humanitarian sector, as well as working, I guess, at the intersection of where design research meets design innovation broadly. And besides that, like Madhu mentioned, a big part of my work has also been around the exploration of video games as a medium for. Can you still hear me, Madhu? Yes. Yeah. Can you still hear me? Sorry, there might be. Yes, you can. Okay, good.
Very briefly, but we can still hear you. Please carry on.
Yeah, sorry about that. There's some internet problem here. Yeah, so I was saying that a lot of my work over the last decade, I've been exploring the use of video games as a medium for innovation, so to speak, but also as a medium for exploring the world around us. Also exploring, in some sense, the junction between materiality and immateriality, between the physical and the virtual. As we all know, we are living in a world right now where our individual daily lives are, in fact, a hybrid of a virtual and a physical existence. And so the topic of today is actually extremely interesting for me because I'm grappling with this all the time. As a human-centered designer working in the development sector, I obviously realize the value of the physical, the real, the intimate, the human. But as of someone who's making video games, I'm also obviously very excited by the possibilities that virtual spaces bring to the world that we inhabit today. And lastly, I just wanted to end with just a brief note on a specific aspect of my work, which is around essentially the topic of decolonizing video games and decolonizing virtual spaces. And inside that topic of decolonizing, there actually are a lot of interesting issues and relevant factors which we can talk about on this talk, which are affecting video game design. And through that lens, we can explore the larger question of materiality and materials specifically. Yeah, I'll pause there, and of course, happy to contribute as the talk goes on.
Thank you, Avi. And that brings us to perhaps the most abstract way of looking at material as designers, and is to understand material and material cultures. So whether our current choice of material is defined by specifically, very bland, practical things of production, supply chains, logistics, or are we using a material palette or a fuel type essentially because of things like colonization? Are there systems at place and work that systems that are in place that kind of in many ways forces design in a particular way? So thank you all for that introduction. I think to the wonderful work that all of you are doing, but also to this problem of material. So I'd like to begin first with the three designers here, and ask them whether they feel that within their own discipline, and Ashay, maybe you can kick things off. We'll come back a full circle to you. Whether you feel that certain domains of design or certain design disciplines are easier to kind of convince or easier to work with, whether it's fashion or product or, so now you're talking about perhaps your textiles being used in the interiors of automobiles. Is there a sort of differentiation between different design fields in terms of how accepting they are to new technologies, new materials, and this notion of salvaged, reclaimed material, and whether you feel that that's in some way linked up to any of the other things that people have spoken about?
I do think it's easier in fashion and apparel for designers to use recycled or reclaimed materials. It's been done since the 80s. So Yeah, it's been around for a long time. There's already materials that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Um,
Yeah, why that would be?
I mean, I think it's just like the economics of it. I think, natural fabrics are expensive. Wool and leather, they're very expensive. They're, hard to process and manufacture. Um, and, it's just clothes and shoes. They're not always functional. They're, it's fine if a t-shirt lasts for, a few months. It's the people are still very forgiving
So
of it.
perhaps the kind of built-in obsolescence is to the max. in the
Yeah, yeah.
apparel
I mean,
industry, right? It's like
yeah,
every fashion,
exactly.
every season.
Exactly. So, the brands want you to buy every season, so yeah, it's a little easier for, I would say, fashion. Just because it's been done for so long, it's not like life and death. It's it's fun. And yeah, but it's not like that with Theli. Our shoes are not designed to be to go bad or degrade in a few months. We make them so that they can last you a few years. You can also return them, and we can fix them up for you, or we can deconstruct them and responsibly recycle them. All the materials that we've used, we made sure to use them in such a way.
Cool. Actually, that's a very important point you brought in, and that I'll maybe I'll use that as a segue to go back to Pedro. And is this idea of when you said salvaging components of buildings, and you spoke about how in terms of the teaching of architecture, that's not even remotely part of the pedagogy. Like there's no stream of consciousness that imagines buildings can be reclaimed in bits and parts, and that there's something to be done creatively with that. Uh, do you feel that there's something inherently wrong about how, say, architecture or furniture design or product design or things that you like, folks that you worked with, that prevents them? Is there a mental block? Is it pedagogical? Is this how we're taught? Is this how the business is run? Where do you think the issue lies in turning people around?
Yeah, I think one of the Arquivo, though we are leading a very unique way of thinking architecture, and there are not many enterprises like ours in Brazil. But we are a very non-radical enterprise in the sense that we're trying to convince people little by little. So if you want to do a very traditional apartment design where everything's new and you can insert one single reuse door in this apartment, we think you are already trying in some sense. Of course, the more ambitious you get, the harder it gets as well. But one thing we are trying to do now is like there are many people that are in tune with sustainability and want to be sustainable, and actually doing it's hard. So we are trying not to say, oh no, you can't do reuse because you have a mental block. So there are really hard things to solve. And one of the biggest things in architecture is that the way we designed the system of architecture, but also in the whole world, it went for more labor separation. So if you look in the early 900s, the architects, the clients, and the material structure were frequently the same person. So, and this is one thing that makes it a lot easier. So if I'm designing a house for myself, for me to take a reuse door and say, oh, I'm gonna put this door over here, it's extremely easy. But the labor force and the system of architecture, I don't know, grew to a sort of extent where the person who builds the building is not the same person who designs the building, which is not the same person who will use the building. And you have a complex system of insurances and distribution of responsibilities. So if a window goes wrong in my building, whose fault is it? Is it the fault of the original fabricator of the window, which is a company that doesn't exist anymore? It's closed 100 years ago. Is it the designer? Is it the constructor? So contemporary architecture is designed on a system of distributing responsibilities, which is very hard for reuse material. Because if it's very hard for me to attest how much wind will a reused window exist, even though I know from practice that reused windows are actually stronger than newer windows, but to do this in the formal way, it's still very hard, and that's, I think, it's one of the reasons that informality it works so well with reuse. So basically, Arquivo is trying to bring reuse to the formal world of Brazil. But if you go to a favela, reuse is everywhere, because in the favela, generally, the person who is constructing is the same person who will live in the house and is the same person who is going to buy the material. So the least amount of people a design has to travel through, the easier it gets. So in this sense, I would say that nowadays, the kind of design that makes reuse easier is the kind of design that goes through the least amount of hands. And that's why, I don't know, like carpenters, we have 2 associated companies with us, which are companies from France, which are basically carpentries that work with reused material. But as they are the designers and the craftsmen, it's so easy for them. And it's not easier for bigger companies.
So if I can just kind of try and summarize what I'm understanding is, you feel that perhaps there is a big pitfall in sort of over specializations, number one, in kind of creating specializations, and then in that specializations to start creating standards of performance that are far removed from the actual use and production of objects and materials. And finally, I think the more critical thing is your reference to informality, and something that even Bharti spoke about, is that even the idea that designers and fabricators are in some way or manner distinct from users, and the fact that very little gets designed that is actually designed for self-building or self-making or self-fabricating. Many years back in the 60s and 70s, people would make things for themselves, sweaters, there'd be things at home, toolboxes at home for repair, and you would get both material and instructions that would allow you to do that. And perhaps that's what Bharti was talking about. And then the past 10 or 15 years, one has seen a complete evacuation of that. Pedro also mentioned how, while we are planning for use obsolescence, the stuff that we make are built in so many layers of composites of material that make it so rigid and robust that it's literally impossible to peel things apart and use them in bits and pieces. Avi, let me come back to you. You run successfully a multidisciplinary design organization. You yourself are trained, if I'm not mistaken, in product design or accessory design. And you've now jumped to this sort of virtual world as one of the main things that you're doing right now. In your experience, has there been any sort of lethargies amongst certain designers about thinking about material afterlives? The kind of work that you did at Quicksand, where you're thinking about base of pyramid use, where you're looking at human-centered design, do you find that you find it difficult to get people to think like that from certain disciplines of design? Is there something like that, or would you put it down to a sort of a different time and age kind of situation?
Thanks, Madhav. Thanks, everyone. Amazing thoughts on the table. From my perspective, there are 2 perspectives. I think if I take the lens of like human-centered design and design for the development sector, or design for social impact, as you may call it. I think there's just a lot of work to be done to bring that kind of thinking to the issues that you're talking about. Because in some sense, human-centered design and innovation in general has unfortunately become a tool for furthering certain notions of corporations and further notions of production, notions of progress through design. We're currently, I personally feel, in a very gray and tricky area globally as well as in India, because the trends in design are actually pushing you away from the things that you're talking about today. And in some sense, there is, while one might think that with greater concerns around sustainability and climate change and the overall discourse that's happening around the world, even like decarbonization, any of these kind of sub-genres and topics of the larger discourse around the planet, the fact is that designers are still maybe the number one enemy of the planet, because they sometimes have the tools to instigate projects and to connect human realities to progress. And that connection is not always ethical. That connection is not always well thought out. And honestly, designers are, in some sense, not the only parts of this equation, and they're a very small part of it. But the current discourse around design and innovation has also pitched design and innovation in the last 10, 15 years as a central force for change. I feel, working on this for many years now, I do feel me and also our studio in general are definitely going through a period of reflection to reformulate what design needs to be in the context of some of the issues that you mentioned. On the context of the virtual world, which I can talk about a bit more, there is a very interesting progression of, if you just look at video games and related industries, there is a very interesting progression that's happened, obviously from the birth of video games globally in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that kind of early time. But more specifically, looking at the last 2 decades, it has gone from trying to make high quality digital products where material design, so to speak, is essentially a profession inside the video game industry. And that profession has typically constituted looking at new technologies to create digital materials, new ways in which they can be made closer to reality, so on and so forth. But in recent times, because of the explosion of the requirement for digital materials, including trends like Web 3.0, even generative AI, digital heritage, and many of these kind of all adjacent industries and movements, the scope of material design has actually become, I would say, very complex and very hard to comprehend at this point in time. And I say that because, let's say you take a look at generative AI, right? And you take a look at a generative AI-based pipeline to design, let's say, an ornate pillar from South India, a carved stone pillar from South India. And you take a look at the other ways to get there, like traditional 3D sculpting, for example, or photogrammetry and 3D scanning, for example. And then you take a look at AI on the other end. Now, these are two very, very different ways of approaching the materiality or the material design aspect of that materiality. And all three have very distinct and sort of sometimes difficult to comprehend impacts on people, on livelihoods. It's not very clear, for example, the relationships that one is talking about in the real world, for example, with the plastic bag example, or with old buildings that can be recycled. There's a very tangible aspect which makes some of these discussions a bit more, while they're still complex and maybe wicked problems, as people are describing already, they're still tangible, so to speak, in terms of the materiality. When you push that whole argument into the metaverse or into virtual spaces, it becomes very complicated, and it also becomes much more disheartening. For example, if you look at the challenge of bringing in non-traditional creators into the world of making video games. So, for example, a sign painter who traditionally would have painted signs on the street or artwork on walls, or a wood sculptor who is carving wooden pillars, and so on and so forth. How do you bring that skill? How do you bring that heritage? How do you bring those materials, so to speak, and also the humanity that is behind those materials? how do you bring that into the virtual world is a somewhat of an obsession of mine of late. And I've been in a nutshell, investigating the phrase, a phrase which could loosely be called as the circular design of video games. And therefore asking the question that in a completely digital pipeline and a digital outcome, where is the room for the circularity that involves human beings and human situations and real materials? Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. I think Bharti got a little worried that all these designers are talking and will she get will she get another chance to speak? No, please. So this is actually a good point. The reason why I wanted to get the designers out of the way is to actually put to you a question that perhaps you would be able to inform us about. So while you have lots of comments, and I'll encourage you to share those also, but one thing that I'd like you to do is also talk about that in your experience at Chintan, is there a substantial cause to advocate that we start looking at designers finding themselves roles at different parts of the production and consumption cycle, and not just restrict themselves to the very initial part of, as Pedro referred to, like abstraction to detailing, of the initial production. We've got examples of both Ashay and Pedro who are trying to relocate, and they both talk about the sort of complexities that they have to go through. So what is your perspective, given that you not only have a sense of afterlife of material because of the work you do with waste pickers, but also the broader question of resource depletion, climate change, and biodiversity loss, and things that inform Chintan's ecological advocacy?
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I at least know other people in this audience who were concerned about these things. But first of all, I think there's a real problem when we really see products which are really slick and then we're told they're green. Because the fundamental problem is consumption. I mean, how much should we just go on and on consuming? And I really urge designers to think, and designers do great things. We would be really miserable people if we didn't have better and better products. I mean, I found a pair of chairs from the 1940s that was somehow in my house. And I was very excited, but it's so uncomfortable compared to the remakes of Amar Colony. So, so I appreciate that people have looked at all those kinds of human needs. But I think when the impetus to make us consume as a consumer base is very worrisome. And it bothers me. Of course, the thing that truly bothers me is our own societal stupidity, that we say, oh, this is organic cotton and let me so I can buy two. No, you can't buy two. In fact, try and live with the least. And every time you don't have to design green products, just design products that will last and that we can repair. And I think very often it makes me very angry. I mean, even with dress, a lot of stuff is spilled on it. And I take it to the pavement darzi and he keeps repairing it with whatever thread he has because he has to hide the very ugly stains. And now I have these new, more artistic stains, which are intentional. But at least I can wear this dress and not feel completely awkward. But I am obviously a kind of fashion victim, that I mind wearing clothes that look like this. It's So firstly, I think I really want to give a thumbs down to green consumption, because it's just a rarefied version of consumption. So I think we should really go away from there. The other thing I think is we really have to think about what it means when you're talking about should designers engage with other parts. And let me just give you some big global examples. I'll just give you one or two. But so often now, as the world is talking about fossil fuels, we know that plastics happened very largely because when the aviation, when you had to actually refine, petrochemicals, you had this layer which was quite inferior, and then you had to very, very innovatively, and I'm not at all decrying, it is a huge innovation, plastics. And I appreciate that you can't get rid of plastics from every part of your life. I mean, how do you do many, many things? Having said that, I say that now that we've understood that fossil fuels are a very, very major source of both air pollution which, by the way, I mean, we're sitting in Delhi just 3 days ago. The U Chicago, the Epic School taught us we were losing 12 years of the life. And that's not such a big problem as the fact that 5 years ago they said 9.2. So it's not very comforting that every now and then we're losing more and more years, but fossil fuel certainly has played a role. And as we look at phasing them out, whether or not you're successful, you also have to think that the what's happening is now you might say, okay, everything's going to be EV. And that's another whole story. Where are all your sources of lithium coming from? Some of it comes from Congo. Look at Gabon. There's been a huge political disruption in Gabon. And Gabon is like 25% of the world's magnesium, which is quite shocking. Magnesium is often added to light products, right? To lightweight products, it gives them strength, so on and so forth. So apart from supply chain disruption, Gabon's actually really poor because it suffers from the resource crunch. Nothing ever reaches the real people. No education, no hospital, just this one family minting the money. So I think designers in many ways can be the environmental diplomats of our time if they're able to rethink it and reduce the dependency on shaky, dark, dangerous, inequitous, human rights violating chains. It's one thing to, and that's why I don't like this concept of, not blood diamonds. I mean, why do you need to dig up everything and wear those rocks? Is my point. I mean, give it up, because people are drowning and dying and in our own country. I mean, a few kilometers away from us. So that's the second thought about how global supply chains are also very vulnerable. And I think designers should think about that. For example, I also don't understand how careless policy can be. I mean, how is it that all these new suitcases are very, very difficult to recycle. And it's not necessarily that the technology is not available. What really is the problem is how do you get it to that technology? And I see no reason why that onus should be on people like you and me. I mean, or even you, if you could recycle them. Why aren't we putting in, we understand that there are hundreds of, suitcases out there. Someday they'll be destroyed. So what are we going to do with it? Why is it not possible? Why is there not enough? Why is there no law that forces Samsonite and even lesser known brands to put in place something responsible? And the hope is that when you do something like that, your design community is also pushed, because now these rules are saying, okay, you can reuse. That's going to be considered, but there will be standards on reuse. So your design communities also then got a bit of a fillip, rather than being told, just make the best selling thing that we can market. And this is what our market thing shows. And everyone wants yellow now. The design community is like, can we pull this apart and reuse it? Because then that will save us money. And there. So I think our policies in this country, actually globally, but we're talking in the capital, also seems not to think that it matters. And who bears the brunt? When landfills catch fire, it's only poor people who live near landfills. I mean, look at Kochi. Kochi keeps catching fire. It's like some kind of annual macabre ritual. I'm not even talking of other cities like the great city of Delhi and the even grander landfill firing of Mumbai. But, we are breathing in our trash. The poor are breathing it more. Their children are born with the most ridiculous diseases. So that's the third point. And finally, I had written a couple of things down. I think for me, what was also quite important finally is about, I think designers are a community that I'm not saying that I should hear from them or anyone should hear from them, but I think teachers, for example, speak louder and louder about the crises, the societal, environmental, planetary crisis we're in. And I think, some teachers do and some don't, but when some do, others come out. And I think designers also, product designers and all also need to talk to other communities. I mean, and talk about this crisis and find ways that their creativity and their enormous skill shouldn't really, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, push for better laws, be part of the planetary solutions beyond just being designers. I say be more activisty.
You'll find many takers amongst designers for advocacy, but armchair advocacy. So let me try and put Ashay on the spot. 2 points. Firstly, something that Bharti alluded to, which is to say that somehow if you use recycled or salvaged material, the emphasis on slickness of the product gets lost. Now you're wearing some pretty slick kicks. I'm being controversial. I'm trying to instigate a but there is there is something to be said that aesthetically there are certain assumptions that if it is repaired, if it is somehow it doesn't construe an aesthetic that is either new or speaks of innovation or so on and so forth. Whereas your endeavor right now is to try and, I guess, change that in terms of what stuff looks like once it's gone through its processes. So I want to understand whether in your attempt to sort of create a sellable product, right? And like anyone your age, I'm imagining you have ambition for world domination, right? So so if that is the attempt, is it actually possible, feasible, or have you just come up with one sort of amazing product or material that seems to work and there's nothing beyond that? Or have you learned more about that? That's one part. Right? And the second is your technology open source?
So yeah, the thing about recycling and making things from waste materials, it's just a very long process. It's very easy for me to just go into the market, buy whatever fabric, whatever rubber technology for the soles, and make a new shoe every few months. With products like ours, it's just there's just a lot more thinking involved. So very often, it takes you like 4 or 5 months to get to a prototype, and then by the time the world has moved on. So that's we're not very trend based. I'm not trying to make something for this year. I'm trying to make it for 2030 or the next century. So yeah, that's one part of it. And sorry, the other part, there was just like open source. No. So the current fabric right now, it's not open source. It's because we're trying to launch it, just the fabric itself. So sometime next year, designers and pretty much anybody will be able to buy the fabric, order it in any specifications that they want. But we've got something else that we've planned. We're working on 3D printing an entire shoe from start to finish. It's made with one material, so it's easy to recycle. It's not strange looking, it looks quite nice. And because it's 3D printed, it's all made in house. We're basically able to launch a new product every 20 days. And we're also able to, take the same worn out shoe from people, melt it down, and then make another shoe right away. Not saying that you'll have a new shoe every 20 days, but it's just, for us, that's the production cycle that we're able to do. Yeah, that's how we're doing
No,
it.
fair enough. I was just putting you in the spot, but I think there's a fair understanding of the kind of problems that we're facing. That on one hand, designers should, in all correctness, be encouraging people to consume less in a sort of a planetarily responsible way. And on the other hand is to say that, look, at a certain level, as human beings, consumption is inevitable. And so can you build in methods that use technology, interestingly, that can at least mediate or ameliorate the extent of the problem. Pedro, I'd like to, sorry. Yeah. No, Mike. Bharti says, and have policy. I think that of course is critical, but let's look at that in the spirit of what Bharti said, that, I mean, at the end of the day, all of us as designers, as practitioners, as consumers, and as human beings on this planet that are forced to share it with other species, owe it to ourselves that we also activate and start looking at what it means for us to be advocates at a policy level. But Pedro, if I could take this to you, I've noticed that, if one wants to buy a really expensive luxury car, one doesn't really need to. You can almost always lease it. At least that's the case here in India. But somehow with material that's used to build stuff with, there's a sort of finality in which producers hand over the responsibility of the afterlife of material after obsolescence to the consumer. And I think that's also been documented that very often that sleight of hand with which folks who produce stuff hand it over as a responsibility to all of us as end users to say, now you deal with it, you recycle, you separate your garbage, you do what you were. Whereas it's perhaps simpler for people to buy back or reclaim. Now, I know you're kind of fighting a lone battle. I haven't come across too many companies that are doing what you do in an organized way. But are you able to find, to form alliances with more mainstream companies in terms of what they do in their products and like how they, is it possible for us to imagine a future where building material could be leased? Sorry, Pedro, did you catch me?
Yes.
Hear everything I
me?
said? I asked you a very long question.
No, yes, I've heard it, everything.
So go for it.
So I think yes, but I'm not sure if that would be desirable in a sense. So there's a certain poetry to architecture and to construction and to life in a sense. So I know there is a certain theory of sustainability, which is big companies that are owners of entire buildings. And by being owners and leasing everything, they can have a more circular approach to their materials because it's all theirs. But in that sense, in terms of who inhabits, you end up restricting a lot the life of who inhabits a building. And for me personally, there's a certain poetry in inhabitation and in ownership, which is lost. And I think the idea that we're going to become a society of renters of buildings and materials and everything from somebody else, which is not somebody, it's a big company. There's a lot of loss of agency in that perspective. So even though I think it's technically feasible, and which it may be useful for some stuff, it's not a world in which I would like to live in. I think the idea that you have a house and then you have a kid and you have to renovate the house because you now have a kid, but then your kid moves away and you have to, in a sense, change. Like the life of a human being is the life of changing space. And I don't think that's a thing we should run away too much from. I would like to comment on the previous comments, which I think there is a really important issue that as designers, we are creators of desire. And that's a thing that usually is very frowned upon, but it's something that we have to look at with care. So in architecture, the biggest crisis for the social architect is that no matter what you do in architecture, you're always raising the value of that where you intervene. So if I want to renovate I don't know, favela and make houses better. The moment I make the houses better, that becomes an asset and is going to be sold, and then gentrification. So the generation of value is the biggest crisis for the architect in terms of ethics, in a sense. But we already tried to solve this in ways that haven't been useful. So if I think in the 70s, radical Italian design, it was basically the idea that they hated the idea that a product was a status symbol. So that I have this really old bed in a noble wood, and it's really worked into, really crafted. So that's a status symbol for the richest families, and design is a symbol of status. What they did, they said, no, let's design in plastic, and let's design objects that cannot become a symbol of status, because in that way we will attempt to end or to diminish inequality through design. The result of that attempt is obsolescence. So the opposite of seeing value in stuff, it's seeing value in nothing, and everything is disposable. So now we're kind of looking at the trend backwards. We're seeing, oh, okay, maybe a bed that is in a sense a status symbol, but it lasts for 200 years. And because it is a status symbol, the mother passes to the daughter, that passes to the son, and the product lasts. That has a certain sense to it. So in a sense, I think that the crisis we're facing now is the crisis of, okay, designers shouldn't always be creators of desire, but we have to some extent to create desires, but the desires should be not only created, but perpetuated. And that's the hard part of design. How to create desire, but not to make this desire vanishing thing that lasts 15 days. How to make desire that lasts.
That's actually, I mean, I'm quite impressed by the philosophical implications of what you just said. I think that's a fair point. I mean, it's quite clear that one way of looking at it is to say that, okay, reduce your footprint, reduce your desire. Maybe you try and look at material leasing. But as Pedro pointed out, that could end up resulting in situations where there is actual genuine loss. And those losses are to do with memory, to do with aspiration, and the creation of inequalities. Only some people can have certain dreams and hope to use certain designed objects. And that actually, if I could now bring that now neatly to Avi, and you see the thing with culture, the idea of material in some way holding cultural value, and the idea of propagating that through, say, liberalization. I think Pedro talked about that. You know, if we were not to imagine designers as specialized producers of ideas who are trained and created, and if we were to imagine a reality or a future where everyone is a designer, everyone is enabled to design, fabricate, use, as Pedro said, in a continuum without a break. And that could possibly be, those methods of production and consumption, possibly be an easier way out of the problems that we see around material. But Avi, as kind of, you spend some time elaborating on how there is material in the virtual world as well. There is a need to create material. There's a need to kind of look at material creation and material creating engines, rendering software, for the lack of a more blunt term. What are your thoughts on whether this is actually a feasible thing in the sort of, blink and miss world that one is seeing in the metaverse, in the world that is virtual, or that, the sheer capacity to generate material renderings that, say, generative AI throws at you? Does it devalue the sort of cultural essence of material, the idea that material holds culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Madhav. Thank you. I feel like definitely there are two forces at play. One force is as the virtual production world catches up with reality, so to speak, which you can see in advancements like digital humans and photorealistic environments and real-time interactions with complex 3D worlds and so on and so forth. that trend in some sense makes people feel that, I mean, more in love with the virtual world because it kind of brings them closer to what they've seen as reality. But behind that kind of, I think behind that kind of sheen of the virtual world and the marketing that's attached to the virtual world production as today, there is, I think, a more complex psychological aspect, I feel, which you can see it in two ways. One is the world of creators themselves. As you said, as digital creation becomes democratized, as is a popular term to use in this context, it also has the danger of, in some sense, wiping away what are more formal creator economies. And this includes the world of designers, includes the world of visual artists, animators, motion animators, 3D sculptors, and so on and so forth. And it also, on the other hand, creates a lot of noise around creation. And when I say noise, I just mean like a excessive creation or over creation itself creates a certain kind of a noise. And in that kind of a world, some of the benefits of the democratizing of design, most probably, I feel we may not live to see that day, because the excessive noise in the system will not necessarily let people enjoy the fruits of democratization of the creative process. Now, one of the complexities here is, in India specifically, when you look at culture also playing an important role in the virtual worlds of tomorrow, there are, again, one issue is that Indians are fast losing touch with their own heritage. I would say not culture, but if you use the word heritage for obvious reasons. And at the same time, there are a lot of political as well as media-centric forces that are capitalizing on heritage and culture to create, let's say, entertainment products or political economies and so on and so forth. So again, with that kind of a polarizing force that exists, and between these kind of factors, it's actually a very complicated space, the space for culture, because we are living in a world where, I'm sure everybody in this room and in this forum believes in the multicultural diversity that is India, that is South Asia, that is Africa, that is the whole world. But the marketing economies that surround virtual production, so to speak, are not that multicultural, and they are more monocultural. As forces, they are monocultural, and as the values that are behind those, they are fairly monocultural values. So so I think it's a very complicated question in some sense. And my take on culture is just that there is a huge opportunity to preserve, conserve, and take Indian culture or South Asian culture to the next generation. But I fear that in all of this noise, we may not be able to get there.
Okay, great. So now, as is traditional at Design by Design, we now open this conversation up beyond the roundtable, both virtual and real, to include all of you. So I have my colleague here, who, if you can take this mic, we'll share a mic in response. And Hardik, you mind, or someone else? All right, cool. Thank you. You need to turn it on. So, okay, let's start with the gentleman in the left corner. And
yeah, I just want to point out a thing from the point of view of a lay person. It's not just material and design. Technology also comes to be in a major sense. I'll just describe my difficulty. We have blinds in our apartment designed by Anagram architects, and those blinds give trouble all the time. And when I wanted to replace it this time, I found those blinds have gone out of the market. Instead of folding blinds, you have no roller blinds. Folding blinds, I think, looks much better than the roller blinds, but the roller blinds is the only one that is available. So unless something else is done, we have lost some beauty in the design, I think. Yeah.
Since you pointedly aimed that gun at me, there's something to be said that a lot of these sort of innovations and technological improvements in products that we see, including the ones that we've got in your house, are always suggested, and this is my problem with material as well, is always suggested technologically to be the next best thing. I'll put you in touch with an excellent chick maker who does extremely good Chinese blinds, which I have in our home, which you visited. And hopefully we should resolve that problem. But let me take this as a moment to ask Ashay to, so a lot of your work is in equal measure to do with shoe design, but it's actually trying to break ground on new technology, right? And if you are planning to take this to market in other sort of domains, clearly that technology has to be adaptable, scalable, so on and so forth. So as a designer, how do you look at technology? What is the role of you as a designer, as an instigator of technology?
I mean, like, we use technology all the time. I mean, we do. Yeah. I mean, it's, we find people who we work with, like right now, this 3D printing thing that I told you about, we're working with somebody who has nothing to do with shoe design. They're a printing on demand service, and there are a bunch of people who design 3D printers, and we had to work with them on how we can make shoes in a 3D printer that has a a limited sort of bed size, and there's a bunch of things.
Just to get you to, I think, pinpoint, I think what Mr. Panchapakeshan was pointing out was that are you that involved in the technology aspect? Do you lead the directions in which the technology gets to, or do people as technologists or materialists come to you and say, look, this is what you can do, think about it, does this work for you? And then you kind of mix and match.
I mean, I hope people would come to us in the future, but right now it's me, trying to find solutions, and trying to find people who maybe they're not in the same industry at all, but are able to help us find solutions, and uh, probably already have something that we can use uh, for us. Like, for example, right now we've got this boot coming out. That's like a motorcycle boot, and it's got the thickest laces ever. So how do you make the eyelets for the laces? Because they don't exist. So we had to work with this one factory in Agra that makes like ends for big wires, and then we had to use that for our laces. But yeah, it's I hope people come to us in the future, but right now it's just just us finding people and working with them.
Bharti, since a lot of new technology ends up in new waste, as you pointed out, so do designers not, do you find that there is a problem about design and technology, or is there a sort of a herd mentality to new technology and a sort of eradication of the old? A lot of your work in what you say is the problematic term of unorganized or informal being sort of detrimental to the very notion that more craft-based technologies or technologies that are not necessarily mechanized are perhaps fertile ground for revival or regeneration, and whether that is what will lead us to redemption in some form.
I think both will either, I mean, for sure, if you're looking at, say, the skills of a mochi, those skills, I'm not sure they need revival, but what we definitely need is a revival of how we think of our cities. Because mochis, we did a survey, and all of them had only two complaints. Basically, it boiled down to access to market. And they said, now nobody lets us sit where people can see us. So nobody can see us. So firstly, we lose all new potential clients, and then we don't have access to money. All the money they wanted was under 5 lakhs, which is the hardest kind of loan to get. So, so I think I'm not, obviously there are inputs you can do, but there is no place in newer cities. I mean, look at, because we're in Delhi, but look at Gurgaon. Where's the street life? How can a mochi possibly exist in Gurgaon? And many other places are becoming like this. They like throw all these people in a corner and hide them. So first of all, there's a need to rethink our communities. and there's a rethink place to keep space and prominent space and all of that. But when you're talking of technology in a larger sense, I think we love, I mean, it's very strange how everyone has given up on innovation and so on in certain kinds of environmental spaces. And technology is the panacea. And a great example of this is smog towers. So we put up a 20 crore smog tower in Delhi. And when we went to actually measure the AQI, it was really crappy if you went beyond 10, 15, 10, 12 meters. It was as bad as any other place. We've thrown that money, but it's not enough. After that, all the other cities copied it because they said, nahi, kuch to karna chahiye. Even builders are copying it because they're like, okay, ma'am, but you can, like your children can play in these 10 meters. So what I'm saying is there's a certain inferiority complex that a lot of rational thinking, highly intelligent people experience when a technology is put there and they're almost saying ki, this tech can't be wrong, but maybe I'm wrong. And I think there's a very dogmatic position also against activism because, you know, we're going and measuring this and they're telling us that, first of all, you're not desirable people. And on top of that, aap fir koi solution do, but solutions are systemic. And we can't jolly well say, keep all the kids home forever. You know, I hope you know that July this year was the first time the air in Delhi met Indian standards, and last year it was September. So you have to have systemic solutions, and especially for the poor, which woman can sit forever inside her juggi and look after some kid? The kid will play cricket in hazardous air if you close down schools. So I'm talking systemic, but there's a love for tech. And it's a very frustrating experience because tech is easy, tech ticks boxes, tech gets people out of trouble. People can move on saying, bhai, maine to lagaya, kya kare? Aage sarkar ko bolo. You know, so it's even the same for stubble burning. Everyone is trying to solve what to do with the stubble. But that's not the point. The point is stop planting the damned rice. It's drinking up all the water. That's why you burnt everything in the first place, because you wanted it to depend on natural rainwater. Stop planting a crop that doesn't work. We're in the era of climate change. And give subsidies, give some kind of pricing to the farmers so they want to plant a better crop more suitable for that ecosystem. So nobody will look at the long term. The thing is, let's get those happy seeders. If you go to Punjab, as I did just before COVID, all the farmers were giggling away. I'm saying, ye dekho ji, and taking us to see those happy seeders. They said, hamare plot mein to ye, you know, it won't even be able to turn. So I do want to leave you with that disconcerting thought that I do think tech is fabulous. I think it's done some great things. You're a living example for this evening, but there are many other examples of tech. I'm not condemning it, but I'm talking of our relationship with tech. Somehow we kind of have this ability to worship it in a very irrational way. Yeah, fetishize it.
Thank you. On a lighter anecdote, our convener, Professor Chisti, showed up today, and as soon as he got out of his vehicle, he realized that his chappals were completely broken. So in fact, he spent the next hour organizing all of this barefoot, while the chappals went to the mochi at the back for repair. More questions, please. Could you pass a mic around? Maybe we'll go for this side first, since we've done that side. Have you passed the mic out? Sure, please.
My name is Nagaraj, and I write and speak on climate change. I had one comment and a couple of questions. I completely agree with you, Bharati, that one, the consumption is sort of central to the problem, and also that solutions have to be systemic. Also worried about the way in which consumption is not just a personal thing, but also how it's very structurally pushed in terms of a very large industry, and particularly advertising is busy pushing us to consume all the time. And now it's in our phones, because you talk about a product of a friend and you start getting ads the next day, right? So it's just carrying ads around. It's completely. I had a question of Pedro. Pedro, can I ask you, the work you're doing, is it feasible to sort of scale it up if you were to have a greater demand for the kind of recycled housing, wood and other windows, doors and other products that you are engaging in? Is there a sufficient supply for you to be able to widen and enlarge such activity if there were to be great demand for it? Is it sort of scalable up? And I have just one last question quickly. Madhav, we're talking about, in a sense, life cycle. I forget the word that we use so well. About
And obsolescence.
obsolescence. Yeah, exactly.
Even
So,
obsolescence.
taken on a larger scale in terms of centrality of concrete in building and the scale in which it's used. And particularly, I'm staggered by, if I may just take the discussion elsewhere in terms of just the scale. I'm I'm staggered by the statistic that apparently China used more concrete in 2 years or 3 years than the US did in the entire 20th century. And it still blows my mind whenever I hear it every 3 or 4 months. So how long do buildings last on average? Now I realize that there are buildings and buildings, and they're very class mediated, and there's no exact answer to that. But on average, how long does a concrete building last?
Before Pedro jumps in about his,
Thanks.
his sort of his ideas on how his kind of work can scale, I'll tell you officially, concrete has a structural life officially of 75 years. But that is sort of a technical civil engineer's definition. Structural life itself is an ambiguous term, especially structural life based on whether the concrete is repaired and maintained regularly or not. I don't find it unreasonable to imagine that China could have pulled off that feat in concrete that you mentioned, because yeah, so I think that is not unimaginable given that now a lot of infrastructure is essentially built purely out of concrete. There are no other materials even explored. There's a certain industrial infrastructural complex that marches on rolling out concrete in a sort of unbridled way, essentially emphasizing speed of building the infrastructure as opposed to how long that infrastructure will last. So we're building stuff faster and faster, but it's not really the structural thing that kills these things. It's the replacement with newer stuff. So if you build a flyover out of concrete, within about 5 years, it becomes under capacity. There's too many cars on the road. And so then you say, okay, let me widen it. But how do you widen a flyover? You'll see it in all the highways that the NHAI is building out right now, is to demolish the old flyover and build a brand new flyover. So if that's the way infrastructure works, I think it's quite feasible that China has kind of outdone, and wherever China goes, we follow. So more questions. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I guess. Sorry, Pedro. Sorry, I got a little carried away with my own answer. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's not scalable as online banking or as Uber. So it's not something that if I just put more technology in it, I will be able to hire. So more materials will mean more people, but in a proportion that it's much more maintained than the proportion of new materials business, because the issues of restoration will always be to some extent craft. So there are a lot of parts which involve craft. In this sense, it's not scaling will mean hiring more people in a proportion that's not the proportion of a startup. But that, in a sense, is that's a disadvantage, but also an advantage. When we talk about circular economy, that's the whole idea, is that the creation of work or work positions that are not so much linked to the emissions of carbon. So the idea that this growing of reuse may employ a lot of people, it's a good thing, not a bad thing, I would say. But there are lots of places where tiny alterations can be made in order to scale and to better. So in a sense, for us now, finding out where a demolition will happen, it's still like a mouth-to-mouth thing. We have to run the city, seeing construction signs. So that's a very crafted way of sourcing material, which in a sense people could just like put on the website of the city hall, like I will demolish a building. Like the whole public policy can be designed, and in a sense some countries are doing that. In order to be like, oh, I will demolish a building, I have to put on this certain website the materials that will be displayed from this building, so that people like material resellers or designers can look it up into. So in a sense, there is a lot of place for technology and for scaling, but that scale will always demand some art craft work, and that's not a bad thing at all.
Now we'll move to this side. So there are lots of hands up.
Hello.
If I can, request everyone, including all of us here, to keep it brief because we'll soon be thrown out by Allianz as well.
Sure. My name is Sarun Bhatia, and I'm running this public campaign by the name of Lifeline Raha. And it all got started from COVID times. So I think we have to draw a lot of lessons from COVID. It gave us all the solutions, and we have to just re-look into that era, and where we were all collective. You know, the whole world came together, and so was the technology. So, which brought us together. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is the answer lies in minimalism, as you rightly pointed out. I think we all agree over there. And all the designers, we have a role to play here, to change how we look at aesthetics. And I think we can do that. We have to only change the filter through which we see, and analyze the world around us. So to begin with, I guess the air quality index, which is I think the starting point of everything. Why? Let me clarify this. Is the air which we breathe is the source of our existence, good existence. If that is corrupted, everything else gets corrupted. So happens with, let's say, computers. I mean, you have a virus, you see what happens. So I think that is the starting point, that first we have to have proper air to breathe. And for that, whatever is necessary, as Bharti also pointed out, needs to be done. And you mentioned smoke towers. I think instead of street lights, why can't we have, let's say, misting devices, all lined up, on the walkways. The recent speech made by PM on recently 2 days back as well was to we highlighted the skyways and the waterways, and I'm saying, what about the walkways? That's the most important thing, and everything starts from there. And I need not elaborate a little further on this because Madhav is going to kill me.
No, not at all. No, I just, you're right. There is always a problem with minimalism in that I'm reminded of what Sarojini Naidu said about Mahatma Gandhi. If only this man knew how much effort it takes to keep him poor. So I think there are two sides to the coin of minimalism. If there are anyone wants on the panel to comment, otherwise we can move on. Because we are running short on time. The door is half open. So yeah. So okay. I think let's start with him and then proceed to the lady at the back. Yeah.
My take on the entire issue is that designer, there is something beyond design or technology. This economy and the market forces, they are actually not very sincere about their efforts. And more we are talking about sustainability. This is my personal experience. The more and more we are talking about sustainability, we are going unsustainable. Like I'll tell you, a few days back, I had one Nikon camera and I sent it for repairs to the shop. He said, shutter is not, shutter has some problem. but because it is very old camera, actually now 5 years or 4 years has become a very old thing. Somebody will tell you this is very old model. So he said he cannot be, this cannot be repaired. And then for a few days I was worried. Then I spoke to someone and he told me, you send it to Chandni Chowk and then this guy, he will repair it. And he took around 2200 and it is repaired. And that is happening with most of the things. That is the one side. I mean, more and more you need to produce. So it is not the designer, it is not the technology which is not enabling you to do something. Actually, it is market industry which is forcing you to do all this. That is number one. And uh, number two is that every time we are talking about sustainability, and you know, the Indian way, I mean, here I will appreciate, we have always been very sustainable, and as well as reuse and everything is concerned, we have been very sensitive, and that was the most sustainable way, I think.
Well, I'm glad you recognize it. I think that's a problem that Bharti alluded to, was that a lot of that value is not recognized and not given financial value. The lady behind.
Hi, my name is Arshima. I wanted to share some insights from experiences that my husband and I have had in rural Jharkhand, where we were working with tribal communities for 4 years in income generation activities. So he's an earth architect. I'm now working in education. And we were really shocked in some way to see that as communities grow in income, it is basically we are generating unsustainable desires through the way we generate income. So any process of actually increasing in income, it increases desire. And you mentioned desire,
Aspiration.
consumption, yeah, aspiration. So in the process of actually creating jobs, we need to think about how values are changing, have an education alongside, which is about consciousness and reflection on one's own emotions and how they are changing through the process of development. So my postdoctorate was actually looking at how aspirations of children are changing in rural areas. And what we see is that in primary ages, right up to the age of 12, until children go to secondary school in the city, their aspiration is largely in remote rural areas to have a mud home just like their parents. Because their bonds, their attachments are to the family and the social norms. But as soon as when they move to the city and see the architecture of the city and the red brick buildings, their own red brick school, their aspirations change through the means of social pressure to want to acquire greater income, to be able to have the kinds of things that the middle class has. So we really need to think about how aspirations are changing in the process of working in architecture or in other fields, which are changing the values that we are actually creating amongst young people.
Thank you for that. Okay, one more comment, and then I think what we'll do is we'll take one more comment, get a quick round of final words very briefly from our audience. The exit door is partially shut now, so.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shubhi Sachan. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation because I run a space called Material Library of India. And it's like system, decentralized system, the products, all are part of the ecosystem. So, and I have been following Chintan's work and Brixan's work for a while. It's quite amazing. And learning Pedro's and Asha's work to the platform. So a quick question to Ashay. I mean, these are just my thoughts. You might want to answer them. When you're talking about being able to recycle your products, are you actually collecting them back?
So, I mean, we've only been in business for 2 years, so it's not like we've got a lot of returns. I mean, the ones that we actually really recycle are the defects that we get in the factory, because it just happens to be you get at least like 2-3% defects on every time you do production.
Yeah, which is pretty standard.
Yeah, so, you know, we're trying to streamline this process. We're releasing this app this year, which, actually allows you to do so. It incentivizes you to do so. But we're already doing it with at least our defective products. Sometimes there's unsold inventory, that, rats eat them in the warehouse and then you can't sell them, and, pigeons, poop on them, and then there's not much you can do. So we do, we do try to refurbish them. Very, very soon we're doing like a seconds and sample sale at our warehouse. So there's nothing wrong with the products, technically, but they're not the best physically, aesthetically. But you'd still be able to buy them. And some, we're just giving away, we give away shoes all the time to the people who collect waste for us, and, people who work for us.
Okay. Also, like a follow-up question on the materials you were trying to use, you were trying to mention in the in your product that you're using. So, when you're talking about materials, you're talking about two streams of materials: biological nutrients and technical nutrients. But when you're mixing the two, how is the recycling possible? Is what I wanna. I mean, I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So mostly it's the sole that's made from algae. Soles are very easy to rip apart from the upper. Happens unintentionally all the time. So, we don't mix any, bio-based stuff on the upper itself. The insole again is algae with bloom. You can remove it. So we've tried to keep things very separate from each other. And then the new products that we have, that we have coming out next year, most of them will be made from a single material. It's
Yeah,
just
3D printed one.
yeah, it's just the the lattice that we use that is going to determine how soft it is, or how hard it is, or how flexible it is. But that's the plan, that it's all going to be made from the same material. You can use it without socks. There's no insole. All of it's just one.
Just one last
Sure.
thought, not like necessarily a question.
Yeah.
That when you're talking about using these materials, I mean, as Bharti was talking about policy framework, one of the policies which are pretty strengthened in our country are PW and plastic waste management, and we have the sixth edition of it now. None other policy framework has that. And since you're using a lot of different types of plastic, when you mixing two different types of plastics also with each other, I mean, since we work with materials and we face that problem all the time with our clients, it becomes almost impossible to recycle them.
Yeah.
So within the same family of polymers also. So that also kind of creates, I'm not necessarily looking for an answer. You
Yeah.
have a technical answer problem. So I'm just leaving this as a thought out there. So then mixing the two and then separating the two and then being able to do anything with it. And then LD is the kind of material which you're using,
Yeah.
which is very, very highly recyclable with the waste workers, which probably Chintan is working
Yeah.
with. I mean, it's a very highly recyclable material. Whereas in PWM, we have category 3, 4, 5, which are non-recyclable. Have you thought about working with the materials which are already categorized as non-recyclable?
We're constantly trying to innovate. We're recently trying to work with automotive waste. The plastic bit of it that gets left behind after the metal is crushed and recycled and stuff. It's just it just takes time. I'm sure we'll come to it very soon.
No,
But we're
yeah.
trying to do a lot of things, even the 3D printed stuff that I talked about. We're making it so that it can be constantly recycled very easily, melted down very easily. And yes, it's true that LDPE can be recycled, but is it recycled? Not all the time, like especially plastic bags. I mean, yes, but at the same time, the type of plastic bags that we use we're getting it from directly from like, waste management facilities and stuff. Not all of it is recycled all the time. Plastic bottles, very easy. They're been collected for a long time.
But we, as a country, are the biggest recycler. of
No, that's
things.
true. That's definitely true.
I'm
But
not necessarily looking
yeah.
for an answer here. You might not be the technical person. So to say, lastly, just leaving these as thoughts.
sure. Thank you.
Lastly, thank you, Pedro, for talking so much in detail about decentralized systems. And I think it was really nice to hear that how you're talking about technology and how the gentleman was asking about scaling up and how it's all about decentralized approaches most of the time when we're working with these kind of ecosystems. So thank you so much for talking about it every now and then detailing it out.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Can,
Sorry.
can I?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, because I think there's one thing that kind of relates the previous questions with this one, which is one of the hardest problems in architecture is the diversification of materials. So the creation of new materials was really prejudicial for reuse, because if I imagine a building from the, I don't know, the 1500s, every construction was basically 5 materials, which was wood, stone, glass, ceramics, and earth. I don't know, maybe it's earth, the fifth. And in that context, it's really easy that the finger dismantling is gonna be useful for someone, because everyone only has 5 options. Nowadays, like a contemporary architecture has like hundreds of materials. And if you dismantle a MacBook, you will see like thousands of micro parts that are different materials each. So, and that's something that happens in architecture, So the biggest difficulty now is to find a match between what I have and what people want, because the diversification of materials in architecture was so large that it made hard to find matches. So in a sense, that's one thing that I think even as designers, we should be creating materials and everything else. Some kind of restriction to material palettes will actually be very good, and not necessarily a thing that restricts creativity in any sense. So that's one thing I wanted to put.
Thank you. I'm afraid I need to now kind of end this, sadly. Thank you all for your active participation, both here physically present and those of you who are watching us online. I think there's been a lot of ground that we've covered. There's been a lot of interesting ideas on how design can relook at its own relationship with material. With that, I would just like to conclude and ask my colleague to come and help us in matters. But before I let him take over, I'd like to thank you all once again and wish you a very good evening and a safe journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madhav. On behalf of Design by Design, Alliance Française du Delhi, Anagram Architects, and Studio IF, I thank the panelists for joining us and for leading the discussion. Can we have a huge round of applause for them? Now, before we disperse, I would like to take some more of your time and bring you up to date with some of the current and parallel Design by Design activities. The annual D by D International Design Competition 2023 will be announced shortly. Please watch out for the UNI XYZ and Design by Design communications for the same. The work on the Atlas of Infrastructural Nomadology was concluded successfully last year and will be available online in due course of time. The ongoing Design by Design Sanskriti Fellowship 2023 project titled Safe or Not, Gender-Specific Prediction of Urbanscape Safety Using AI is currently in its second quarter. The 14th annual Design by Design 20 Under 35 exhibition 2024 shall be organized in the end of January 2024 next year. You're welcome to self-nominate or nominate others for the same. And lastly, you're welcome to forward your nominations this autumn for the unusual annual D by D award, instituted to honor the contribution made by discerning non-designer supporters towards the extended cause of design-based creative communities. Finally, thanks to all of you for having made it to the roundtable and for being such a dedicated audience. In case you wish to be kept posted about future Design by Design activities, please feel free to fill in your contact details right outside the auditorium. Thank you all. Have a good night and a great weekend ahead.